talks aiming to finalize a global treaty to curb plastic pollution are underway in the South Korean port city of Busan. Activists are calling for an ambitious agreement to restrict production and waste. The world is producing far more plastic than it has the ability to process. Opening the event, the UN's Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution said the issue must be urgently addressed.
People want a deal. And therefore, in Busan, Korea, where this last round of negotiations is being held, we have to land that treaty. And I expect, in fact, I'll be deeply disappointed if countries don't live up to the promise that their citizens expect. And this is not a left or right, or south or north issue. It is a human health issue. It is an environmental health issue. It is an issue about the intergenerational justice of those generations that will come after us when living with all this garbage. We can solve this, and we must get it done in Busan.
The mandate is to address plastics pollution across the full life cycle. And we believe that the full life cycle includes the production of plastics, and those are largely made with fossil fuels. So there's been a strong objection to including the production phase by fossil fuel producing countries that see plastics production as a major growth sector of their economy.
What industry is looking for in terms of the treaty talks in South Korea next week is to try to reach an agreement by focusing on the key challenges here in terms of ending plastic pollution in the environment. So as we like to say, keeping the eyes on the prize. And that's to drive an agreement forward that will address those issues and not extraneous issues, whether it's regulating chemicals or curbing plastic production.
Now to those global talks on climate change, which have been taking place in the Azerbaijani capital, Baku. A deal was finally done a couple of days later than was scheduled, with the rich countries promising to triple the amount of money they give to developing countries to help them deal with the changing climate. But that deal has been heavily criticized as too little, too late.
The goal is too little, too distant. It is 2035, it's too far gone. Our 2030 estimates tell us that we need to do it at 1.3 trillion per year till 2030. But we have only been agreeable to have, or we have a proposal that talks about 300 USD billion mobilization goal. It does not address the needs and priorities of developing countries. It is incompatible with the principle of CBDRC and equity. Regardless of our battle with impacts of climate change, it is a fact that developing countries are accused continuously of emissions, forgetting the high per capita emissions of the developed countries, forgetting also the historical responsibilities of the developed countries. This only adds to the problem at hand for us, and the proposed goal shall not solve anything for us. In fact, we have to implement ambitious NDCs and economic challenges that we need to navigate and address the adaptation needs. The amount that is proposed to be mobilized is abysmally poor. It's a paltry sum. It is not something that will enable conducive climate action that is necessary for the survival of our country and for the growth of our people, their livelihoods. And I'm sorry to say that we cannot accept it.
If we walk back home with 300 and we say that the developed countries are taking the lead, this is an insult to what the convention says. Should I remind us of what the convention says? That it noted that developed countries had the largest share of historical and current global emissions. This might be 1994, but it's still very current till now. It also said that the developed countries would take the lead, and this lead is climate finance. That the developing country is saying that it's taking the lead with $300 billion till 2035 is a joke. and it's not something we should take lightly. I do not think it's something we should clap our hands and force us to take it. But we have a right as countries to choose if we're going to take this or not. And I'm saying that we do not accept this. You expect us to have ambitious NDCs. The NCQG was supposed to enable us to have realistic finance goals. $300 billion is unrealistic.
Some pretty punchy, emotive arguments there at that Global Climate Summit in Azerbaijan. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the international climatologist, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, who is a globally recognized scholar on environmental policy and climate change, and is a UN scientist who served as co-director of the Center for Climate and Justice in the UK. He's also a member of the UN body known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Professor Okereke, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us and enlighten us. Tell us why there's been so much criticism of this deal, given that the amount of money on offer is significantly higher than the amount of money that is currently on offer.
Thank you very much for having me. The reason why you see that level of emotion and criticism for the deal is because, according to several reports that were released ahead of this COP, estimates suggest that developing countries need anything between 5 to 6 trillion to be able to implement ambitious climate actions. Developing countries came to Baku or went to Baku expecting to receive at least 1.3 trillion. But rich countries made it clear that they were not able to meet that demand. And although the tripling of the 100 billion per year to now 300 billion per year represents a massive increase in the quantum of finance being promised by rich countries. But as you can see from the clips that you showed, poor countries thought that is so paltry, that is abysmal, that was unacceptable, and that puts many, many lives at risk.
So, I mean, they wanted a heck of a lot more, but as you said, what they got was 300 billion. But there isn't there, from what we've seen in that agreement, this longer term ambition, isn't there, to try to mobilize $1.3 trillion a year? I mean, is that remotely likely, given all these issues of trust on both sides?
That's a very good question. Recall that 100 billion per year was agreed in 2009 in Copenhagen, and it took more than 10 years for rich countries to meet that target. And actually, whether you agree that they have met that target depends on the accounting system to which you subscribe. So the 300 billion by 2025 is still something that no one can really be sure that rich countries are going to meet. However, the reason why they have chosen 2035 was to create a window for the US to be able to make contribution to that pot after Donald Trump, the incoming president of the US, would have exited office.
But I mean, at the very least, Professor Okereke, this agreement, would you say it gives the world a sense of the direction of travel, even if all the money isn't given now, but there is a promise that it'll be mobilized and given at a later future date?
Absolutely. Actually, from the rich countries' perspective, this is already a lot of money at a time when they are dealing with inflation, high rise in cost of living imposed by COVID-19, at a time of uncertain geopolitical situation with the war in Ukraine, the incoming of President Donald Trump as the next president of the United States of America, and the war in the Middle East. So depending on the way you look at it, you can actually argue that this is not a small sum of money for rich countries to spare. And bear in mind also that the negotiation accommodates the involvement of China to contribute on voluntary basis. So this is seen as a win, that the number of countries that are able to contribute to that pot has increased. And one other thing that it does is sets, as you say, the direction of travel. No one can question that the future is still on energy transition and clean transition, whether Donald Trump is coming to office or not. So this is a pure statement that sets the direction of travel, even as you said, even like you said, the money may take long to come.
So in spite of this deal, I mean, is this conference being seen by some as a failure then? Because, I mean, you had this very dramatic walkout at one point, even though it didn't, in the end, entirely collapse.
Many developing countries and activists are describing it as a disaster, a failure, a death sentence on the livelihood, economy of poor countries. But rich countries are describing it as a success and saying that actually it puts the UN climate negotiation at least on a life support. Others describe it as an insurance policy and say that the success will depend on whether actually rich countries do pay up. In my view, I think realistically, given the fact that we have a president of the US that is going to be very hostile to climate ambition coming in from next year, this is actually quite a good deal, and I'm happy that developing countries accept it. And by the way, Charles, we need to make the point very strongly that it is not enough to go to COP meetings and ask for a large purse of money. Poor countries themselves need to put their house in order and ensure that the monies they receive are put to judicious use. And I'm afraid that is not still the case in many poor countries, especially African countries.
Well, give us an example of that from the country where I am and where you originate from, which is Nigeria. How are they handling this climate change issue in terms of judicious use of funds?
Well, that's a very good question, because if you look at the stock take that I happen to have contributed to recently, it shows that the vast amounts of money that are coming into the country, could be put to a bit more better use. Many years ago, we raised the first green bond, and then the second green bond, about 30 billion. But many researchers and journalists have indicated that the money to which we put those green bonds have not been, the projects to which we put those green bonds have not been yielding good income and carbon credits for the country. So there is a case where we have planted trees, done forestation projects, but we haven't followed up to care for those trees, and many of them have died off. So they are not yielding any credit for Nigeria. They are not greening the environment as supposed. There are also instances of projects that have been money that have been pumped into renewable energy projects that have remained uncompleted to date and revised over and over again on the basis of inflation, and yet there are no profits, no benefits in terms of energy savings or increased lighting for the people.
And you are, of course, an enormously experienced climatologist who is in demand internationally. I mean, in the UK, where you are right now, the United Nations and all the rest of it. I mean, do you see Nigeria making any moves at all to reduce its dependence on the fossil fuel of oil and kind of move in a different direction?
That's a tricky question. I mean, the energy transition plan that was signed indicates that we really do want to reduce our dependency on fossil fuel. But at the same time, we also have the PIA, the Petroleum Industrial Act, which indicates that we want to increase the quantum of our production to 3 million barrels per day. So this is another great example where you see conflict in the climate policy and the mainstream economic policy of the country. So there are many people who have argued that Nigeria signing on to these deals without real commitment to emission reduction. But I would argue that it's a case of a desire to do it colliding with another desire to grow our economy. But what we then need to do is to sit down around the table and try and resolve these conflicts, because actually there are a lot of sides of the moving machine that need to speak to each other.
And on that note, I want to thank you, as always, very much indeed, Prof. We learn a heck of a lot more after we've engaged you in discourse, as they say. Professor Chukwumeri Okereke is an international climatologist, is a globally recognized scholar on environmental policy and climate change, and is a UN scientist who served as co-director of the Center for Climate and Justice in the UK. He's also a member of the UN body known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he was talking to me on the line there from